It was May 1983. Captain Second Rank Dmitry Volkov stood with his arms locked behind his back, his boots bolted to the deck, staring at a screen that was supposed to be routine. They were stationed deep in international waters, but close enough to watch the Americans play their war games off the coast of California at the Pacific Missile Range Facility. It was a milk run. A boring, predictable assignment. The Americans would test launch a Minuteman or fire a new anti-ship missile at a decommissioned Hulk. The Primori would dutifully record the telemetry, the frequencies, the launch signatures. Moscow would be satisfied. Target acquisition. A young Lieutenant Mishin announced. His voice was flat, bored. Primary target, USAF tanker, call sign Argo. Escort, F-4 Phantom, both ascending from Vandenberg. Volkov nodded, sipping burnt-tasting coffee from a steel mug. Standard observation posture, Lieutenant. I want all ELINT frequencies recorded. They might be testing a new jammer pod on that tanker. Yes, Captain. For an hour, the exercise was exactly as predicted. The two American aircraft climbed, circled, and settled into a long, stable racetrack pattern at 30,000 feet. The Primori's powerful radar array painted them as two distinct green blips, one large and slow, one small and agile. Then the monotony broke. Captain! Mishin's voice was suddenly sharp, pulling Volkov from a half-reverie. The F-4 is breaking formation. It's turning on the tanker. Volkov was at his side in 2 strides. What? A training accident? No, sir. It looks intentional. The Phantom is launching. I register a missile launch. An AIM-9. A Sidewinder. The CIC fell silent. The click hiss of the tape deck suddenly seemed deafening. Volkov stared at the screen. A new, faster blip had appeared, separating from the F-4's signature. It was streaking directly, unmistakably, toward the large tanker aircraft. Are they insane? Volkov whispered. Are they shooting down their own tanker? 2 seconds to intercept, Mishin counted, his hand gripping the edge of his console. 1 second. Then, nothing. It wasn't an explosion. An intercept, a missile hitting a plane, was a catastrophic, chaotic event on a radar screen. It was a bloom of energy, a flower of shrapnel as the system was overwhelmed by debris. This was different. The missile blip simply vanished. It did not detonate. It did not miss and fly past. It was there, a solid green mark screaming across the phosphor screen at Mach 2, and then, in the space of a single radar sweep, it was gone, as if it had been erased. Mission? Volkov's voice was a low growl. Report. I don't know, Captain. Mishin was pale, his eyes wide, toggling his filters. The contact is gone. Just gone. Debris? A splashdown signature? Nothing, sir. The tanker, Argo, is completely unharmed. It hasn't even altered its course. Before Volkov could process the impossibility, Mishin shouted again. Launch! Another launch! The F-4 is firing again! A second Sidewinder signature appeared. It too raced toward the tanker, and, at the same precise vector, the same relative distance, it too simply ceased to exist. Check your equipment, Lieutenant, Volkov roared, slamming his mug down. Is this a malfunction? No, sir. All systems green. I'm running diagnostics now. Everything is nominal. Thermal confirms. I had a heat signature, and then it just went cold, like a light being switched off. Again, a third launch. It happened 3 more times. 5 launches in total. 5 separate AIM-9 Sidewinder missiles, some of the most reliable heat-seeking weapons on Earth, were fired by the F-4, streaked toward the KC-135 tanker, and vanished from radar, thermal, and electronic sight, miles before they should have even struck. The Primori was a ghost ship, drifting in an ocean of silence. The crew in the CIC just stared at the screen, where the F-4 was now calmly rejoining its tanker. The impossible, routine exercise continued. Volkov grabbed the microphone for the ship's internal broad circuit. He clicked it on, then off again. What could he say? He walked back to his station, his mind racing, trying to build a framework for what he had just witnessed. This wasn't a jammer. A jammer blinds you. It throws snow and false targets across your screen. It doesn't delete reality. This wasn't a new kind of missile defense. A CIWS, a phalanx, even a theoretical interceptor missile, they all create noise, fire, debris. They are events of kinetic violence. This was the opposite. This was A subtraction. A quiet, sterile, impossible subtraction. Volkov was a veteran of the Soviet Navy. He had seen strange things, phantom signals in the North Atlantic, American spy planes that flew higher and faster than seemed possible. But this was different. This broke the laws of physics as he understood them. This channel, Cold War Impact, is dedicated to pulling back the curtain on these moments. We dig into the declassified files and forgotten histories to find the events that defined the conflict. If you find this story of intrigue and impossible technology compelling, consider subscribing. The deepest mysteries are yet to come. The immediate reaction on the Primori was not panic. It was a cold, deep, and penetrating dread. The kind that settles in the pit of your stomach when you realize the rules you live by are suddenly fundamentally wrong. Mishin, rerunning his diagnostic tapes for the 4th time, looked up at his captain. "Sir, what do I write in the log?" Volkov stared at the empty space on the radar screen where 5 missiles should have been. "You write anomaly. You write 5 tracked targets disappeared mid-flight via unknown mechanism. You write no known countermeasures identified. And you will encrypt that log, bind it, and hand it directly to me." The stakes became horrifyingly clear to Volkov as he stood alone on the bridge wing an hour later, the cold Pacific wind whipping at his greatcoat. This wasn't about one tanker. This wasn't about 5 small Sidewinder missiles. It was about every single missile in the Soviet arsenal. The entire military doctrine of the Soviet Union, its very survival as a superpower, was built on the terrifying mathematics of mutually assured destruction. It was built on the promise that their missiles, their R-36 ICBMs, their Granite anti-ship missiles, their tactical nuclear arsenal would get through. They might lose many, but enough would strike home to ensure the enemy's annihilation. But what if the Americans had a switch? What if they had a weapon that didn't need to intercept, but simply erase? A weapon that could, from a distance, just turn off a missile. The Primori had just recorded 5 data points proving that their entire nuclear shield, their sword of vengeance, was potentially useless. It was a phantom, a ghost in the Americans' machine. And Volkov, with a logbook full of impossible data, had to sail home and tell Moscow that they might be utterly, hopelessly defenseless. The mystery wasn't, what did the Americans test? The mystery was, how much of our power is now just an illusion? Captain Volkov's encrypted logbook was a poisoned artifact. When it arrived at the headquarters of the Pacific Fleet in Vladivostok, it was handled with the sterile caution of an unexploded bomb. The admiral on duty read it once, twice, then sealed it in a lead-lined bag meant for codebooks, and placed a direct, high-priority call to Moscow. He refused to add his own signature to the report. He would be a conduit, not an author. This was not a report of a mechanical failure or an American provocation. It was a report on a miracle or a nightmare. And in the Soviet system, both were equally dangerous to be associated with. When the file landed on a polished wooden desk deep within the Lubyanka, the infamous headquarters of the KGB, the reaction was not disbelief. It was ice-cold, analytical fury. The men of the First Chief Directorate, the PGU, did not dismiss the impossible. Their entire world was built on it. They immediately forwarded the findings to Directorate T, the Scientific and Technical Intelligence Branch, and to the GRU, their rivals in military intelligence. Within 72 hours, a VCHAR, high-frequency, telephone call, scrambled and secure, convened a secret emergency commission. It had no official name. It was simply Komissia po Anomaly 7, the Commission on Anomaly 7. It was comprised of grim-faced men from the Ministry of Defense, lead scientists from the NII-8, Scientific Research Institute 88, specializing in rocketry, and the deputy head of the GRU's 6th Directorate, which handled all signals intelligence. They gathered in a windowless, soundproofed room, the air blue with cigarette smoke. The original tapes from the Primori were played. A civilian scientist, a physicist from the Kurchatov Institute, was the first to speak, his hands visibly trembling as he pointed a wooden ruler at the projected data. "The returns are clean," he stated, his voice hollow. "This is not jamming. Jamming is noise. It is chaos. This is a void. The signal-to-noise ratio is perfect, and then the signal simply ceases to be. It is not masked. It is not redirected. It is gone. The radar cross-section of the targets vanishes in a single sweep. And the thermal? A GRU general growled, his uniform creaking as he leaned forward. The same, Comrade General, the scientist replied. The infrared sensors registered 5 distinct plumes of solid rocket motor exhaust. Then, at the same precise coordinate as the radar loss, the heat signature is extinguished, not cooled. Extinguished. As if it were suddenly enveloped in absolute zero. It is a physical impossibility. The investigation began. It was a frantic, desperate, multi-pronged hunt for a ghost. The first phase was pure data. The Primori's tapes were copied and sent to a dozen different institutes. The consensus was terrifying. The data was real. The event had happened exactly as the ship's crew had witnessed. The Americans possessed a technology that could, at a distance, cause multiple high-speed projectiles to vanish from existence. The second phase was espionage. The KGB Residentura in Washington, D.C. was given a single, top-priority directive: identify Project Argo. Agents who had spent years cultivating assets at the Pentagon and in aerospace firms like Lockheed and Boeing were retasked. They pored over budget line items, cross-referenced contractor lists, and listened for any chatter in the defense community. They found nothing. Argo was the tanker's temporary flight call sign, a meaningless, rotating designation. It was a dead end. The agents reported back with frustrating consistency. They could find endless details on the new M1 Abrams tank, on the B-1 bomber program, on the guidance systems for the new Trident missile. But on a missile-deleting weapon? Silence. It was as if the project didn't exist. This, to the men in the commissia, was even more terrifying. It meant the Americans' operational security was perfect. The third phase was military provocation. The Soviet Air Force was ordered to increase probing flights. 2 95 Bear strategic bombers and their 2-16 Badger escorts began flying aggressive patterns near American test ranges. They would feint toward the edge of the U.S. Air Defense Identification Zone, their navigators tracking the American F-15 seconds and F-14 seconds that scrambled to intercept them. The goal was to trigger the Phantom, to force the Americans to use the weapon again, so it could be studied. The Americans never took the bait. Their fighters intercepted the bombers, shadowed them, and escorted them away, just as they had always done. It was standard, predictable, and gave the Soviets no new data. The Phantom remained hidden. With no new leads, the Anomaly 7 report began to metastasize within the Soviet High Command. It became a legend, a bogeyman. It was whispered about in the secure dachas outside Moscow, in the design bureaus, and in the planning rooms of the strategic rocket forces. The very idea of this weapon was as effective as the weapon itself. It created a pervasive, paralyzing paranoia. How many other impossible weapons did the Americans have? At the Chelomey Design Bureau, the birthplace of the Soviet Union's most powerful anti-ship and cruise missiles, a meeting was called. The chief designer, a protege of the legendary Vladimir Chelomey, stood before his top engineers. He held a copy of the Primori report. "They have a field," he announced, his voice heavy with a fatalism that was antithetical to Soviet engineering. "We don't know what it is. We don't know how it works. But we have been ordered to design a countermeasure. They want a missile that can fly through a void." His engineers stared at him in baffled silence. "Fly through what, comrade designer?" one asked. "A plasma field? An electronic curtain?" "We don't know," the chief designer snapped, slamming the report on the table. "They think it might be a new form of plasma shield. That the tanker, Argo, projected a bubble of energized particles that vaporized the missiles." This was the first wrong conclusion. Born from a kernel of truth, the Americans were researching plasma physics. This theory sent hundreds of Soviet scientists down a rabbit hole. They began theoretical work on ablative missile shields, on new guidance systems that could go dark and fly ballistically through such a field. It was a massive, expensive, and completely incorrect diversion of resources. The GRU had a different, more grounded theory. This was not physics, it was trickery. They believed it was the ultimate form of electronic warfare. The Americans, they argued, had not destroyed the missiles. They had hidden them. They had developed a complex EW signal that didn't just jam the Primori's radar, it hacked it. It had injected a false negative directly into the Soviet ship's processing system, making it think the missiles were gone. The sidewinders had simply been dodged, or perhaps they were dummies, and the whole event was a psyop to terrify them. This theory was comforting, in a way. It meant the laws of physics were intact, but it also meant the Americans were masters of a new, invisible battlefield. It meant no Soviet radar, no ship, no air defense battery could trust what it saw. But the third theory, the one whispered by the most senior and most paranoid generals of the strategic rocket forces, was the most dreadful. The tanker, Argo, was a distraction. The F-4 was a distraction. The missiles were real, but the weapon was not on the plane. It was above the plane. It was in space. Cosmos. The Americans, they theorized, had weaponized their Star Wars program, the Strategic Defense Initiative. The Primary had not witnessed a test of an airborne weapon. It had been the target of a demonstration. A space-based weapon, perhaps in geosynchronous orbit, had fired an invisible beam, a particle beam, a neutral beam, a new kind of laser, and had lanced the missiles from the sky, one by one. The tanker and the F-4 were just the bait, in a carefully staged play, a performance for the Primori's benefit. This theory explained everything. It explained the lack of debris. It explained the instantaneous deletion. And it confirmed the Soviet leadership's deepest, most apocalyptic fear, that the arms race was moving into the heavens, a place where they could not follow. The investigation, which had begun with a hunt for a single Project Argo, now splintered. One part of the Soviet machine was chasing plasma shields, another was trying to build hack-proof radars, and the most powerful part was now staring at the sky, convinced that a new, invisible sword of Damocles was hanging over them, ready to strike their ICBMs from the sky the moment they left their silos. The paranoia was complete. The Soviets were hunting ghosts, plasmas, and phantoms in the sky, and in all their searching, they never once looked in the right place. They never once considered that the answer was the tanker itself. The Kremlin was chasing phantoms. The GRU was hunting for a non-existent space weapon. The KGB was searching for a PSYOP program that wasn't there. The Soviet military-industrial complex was pouring billions of rubles into defending against plasma fields and radar hacking signals. They were all wrong. They were looking in the heavens, in the shadows, and in the dark corners of the electromagnetic spectrum. They never thought to look at the most obvious object in the sky. They should have been looking at the tanker. While Soviet generals convened their secret commissar in smoke-filled rooms, the real story was unfolding in the blinding, high-desert sunlight of New Mexico. The location wasn't a black site. It wasn't a hidden underground bunker. It was Kirtland Air Force Base, a sprawling, ordinary-looking installation just outside Albuquerque, the home of the Air Force Weapons Laboratory, or AFWL. The men in charge were not clandestine spies or shadowy generals. They were engineers in short-sleeved, button-down shirts. They were physicists with chalk on their hands. They were the pilots of the 4,900th Flight Test Group, men who were part aviator, part scientist. And in the mid-1970s they had been given a task that was, by any reasonable standard, completely impossible. The question posed by the Advanced Research Projects Agency, ARPA, was simple and audacious. Could you shoot down a missile with a beam of light? Not in a laboratory, not on a spreadsheet, but from a moving aircraft, in the thin, turbulent air of the upper atmosphere. The project had a deceptively simple name, the Airborne Laser Laboratory, or ALL. The Soviet intelligence ship Primori had logged its target correctly. The call sign was Argo. The aircraft was a KC-135 stratotanker, but the crew's fatal assumption was that it was a normal one. The aircraft they were painting with their radar was NKC-135 Amperes, Air Force serial number 55 to 3123. In the US Air Force, the N designation means Special Test, Permanently Modified. This tanker was one of one. It would never again hold a single drop of fuel for another plane. Its cavernous fuselage, designed to carry thousands of gallons of jet fuel, had been gutted. It was now packed, from floor to ceiling, with equipment that no Soviet analyst could have possibly imagined. It was a flying death ray. The heart of the beast was not a fuel bladder, but a 6-megawatt-class gas-dynamic laser. This wasn't a small, solid-state laser. It was a brute-force, chemical-powered engine. It was, in essence, a rocket motor, turned on its side and bolted to the aircraft's frame. It burned a mixture of benzene and other exotic chemicals to generate an enormous, superheated cloud of carbon dioxide, helium, and nitrogen. This inferno of hot gas was then funneled through a complex series of nozzles at supersonic speeds, creating the perfect conditions for a population inversion, the quantum-level trick that creates a laser beam. This wasn't a laser pointer. It was an industrial furnace, engineered to project a focused, invisible beam of infrared light with enough power to melt steel from a mile away. All of that power was useless if you couldn't aim it. Mounted on top of the fuselage, where a refueling boom operator might normally sit, was a bulbous, rotating turret. This was the ALTS, the Airborne Laser Laboratory Turret System. It was a nautical-style sextant, crossed with a high-speed computer. A set of precision mirrors, controlled by one of the world's first and most advanced adaptive optics systems, would lock onto a target and hold the invisible beam steady, compensating for the aircraft's vibration, the turbulence of the air, and the speed of the target. This was the American solution. This was the leap in ingenuity. The Soviet system was built on imitation and scale. If the Americans built a bomber, the Soviets would steal the plans or, as they did with the B-29, capture one and copy it piece for piece. They would build something like it, but heavier, simpler, and with a bigger engine. They excelled at incremental, brute force improvement. This was different. This was invention. This was the kind of high-risk, high-cost, fundamentally insane leap of science that the Soviet command economy simply could not replicate. The ALL program was a gamble that cost hundreds of millions of dollars, all to answer a question. It was the physical manifestation of a what if. And on May 26, 1983, the Primorye had a front-row seat to the final exam. The event the Soviets had witnessed was a key test in Project CLAW, or Coherent Laser Airborne Weapon. The F-4 Phantom wasn't shooting down its own tanker, it was the chase and launch platform. The missiles it was firing were not standard-issue AIM-9 Sidewinders. They were heavily modified, unguided AIM-9B variants used as Bolo test drones, designed to fly a predetermined, stable path. The NKC 135 amperes, Argo, was the weapon. From the Primorye's perspective, it was an impossible deletion. From the control room inside the Argo, it was a textbook success. Tracking solution locked, the fire control officer would have said, his voice calm. Mirrors are hot, lacing now. The invisible 10.6 micrometer wavelength beam shot from the turret. It was pure focused thermal energy. It struck the first AIM-9B. The beam didn't cause a Hollywood explosion. A missile isn't a bomb, it's a delicate high-speed machine. The laser, focused on the missile's thin metal skin, dumped catastrophic levels of heat into it in less than a second. The Primorye's crew saw the missile vanish because the laser had instantly crippled it. Perhaps it melted the guidance system, sending it into an instant, uncontrolled tumble. Perhaps it burned through a control fin actuator, causing it to lock and shear the missile from the air. Or perhaps it simply cooked the solid rocket motor's casing until it failed, extinguishing the thermal plume the Primorye's infrared sensors were tracking. The result was the same. A solid radar target became a tumbling, non-reflective piece of scrap. A brilliant heat source went cold. An event of unimaginable violence was, from a distance, just a quiet, clean subtraction. The Americans hadn't just built a new weapon, they had built a new category of weapon, and they had just proven 5 times in a row that it worked. The Soviets, hunting for a ghost, had no idea they had just witnessed the birth of the real thing. For months, the report from the Primorye was a toxic file, a career-ending piece of data that circulated in the highest, most secure offices of the Soviet state. It was a data point without a theory. The space-based weapon theory was the most terrifying, but it was also the most speculative. It remained a ghost, an anomaly. The commission was deadlocked. Then the confrontation came. It wasn't a defecting scientist. It wasn't a grainy photograph from a Residentura agent. It was a television broadcast. On March 23, 1983, just 8 weeks before the Primorye incident, President Ronald Reagan had spoken to the American people. The speech was broadcast globally. In Moscow, the analysts at the USA-Canada Institute and the KGB's 5th Directorate, Ideological Counterintelligence, had translated it and dismissed it as pure political theater. Reagan, the cowboy actor, was at it again. He spoke of a new vision for American defense. He spoke of making nuclear weapons impotent and obsolete. He proposed a shield in space. I call upon the scientific community in our country, those who gave us nuclear weapons, to turn their great talents now to the cause of mankind and world peace, to give us the means of rendering these nuclear weapons obsolete. The initial Soviet analysis was one of contempt, propaganda, bluster, a fantasy to placate his right-wing base. They called it Star Wars, a name meant to mock it, to reduce it to a childish Hollywood fantasy. But then, in May, Captain Volkov's report landed. The Komisja po Anamele 7 was reconvened. This time the mood was not inquisitive, it was funereal. A senior GRU analyst, the same general who had scoffed at the initial report, stood at the head of the long wooden table. He held a copy of the Primorie's data in one hand and a translated transcript of Reagan's March speech in the other. He threw the speech onto the table. "Fools," he spat, his voice a low, shaking rumble. "We were fools. We called this Star Wars." We laughed at him. He then held up the Primorie log. "And now, this. Captain Volkov's impossible anomaly. The American ghost that deletes missiles." The room was silent. The connection was now, suddenly, horrifyingly, and inescapably clear. The shock was not a sudden explosion. It was a cold, sinking realization, a linkage of two facts that, combined, spelled doom. Reagan's speech was not a fantasy. It was a declaration. The Primorie incident was not a test of a single new weapon. It was the proof of concept for the entire Star Wars shield. The Soviet High Command went into a state of cognitive dissonance, a panicked shock that paralyzed their strategic thinking. Their ghost in space theory from Part 2 was no longer a theory. It was an active, funded, and proven American program. The Airborne Laser Laboratory, Argo, was not the final weapon. To the Soviets, it was a clear and terrifying signal. If the Americans could mount a laser on a tanker in 1983, what would they mount on a space station in 1990? The men in that room realized the truth. The Americans were not building a weapon in space. They were building a weapon to control space. And, by extension, to control the planet beneath it. The Primorie hadn't just seen 5 missiles die. It had seen the entire doctrine of mutually assured destruction, the pillar that held up the Soviet Union's status as a superpower, vaporized in a single invisible flash. Their entire arsenal of thousands of ICBMs, the rockets they had spent trillions of rubles to build, house in hardened silos, and place on mobile launchers was now, potentially, just a swarm of obsolete targets for an American computer to delete one by one. The response was not rational. It was a desperate, panicked, and ultimately futile lunge. If the Americans were going to build a Death Star, the Soviets had to build one first. The response was named Skiff Polyus. In a matter of months, the Soviet military-industrial complex was ordered from the very top to achieve the impossible. They were to design, build and launch a 100-ton, fully operational, space-based laser battle station. Not a test bed, not a prototype, a weapon. It was to be their asymmetric response, a gun held to the head of America's Star Wars dream. The Polyus was a monster. It was a 120-foot-long, black-painted cylinder designed to house a 1-megawatt carbon dioxide laser, a direct, brute-force imitation of the technology used on the Airborne Laser Laboratory. The problem was, the Soviets were trying to do in 2 years what had taken American scientists a decade to perfect. The program was a case study in terminal, state-level desperation. The laser system itself wasn't ready. To meet the insane deadline, the engineers were forced to launch a functional model. The plan was to launch the massive hull and then, if it survived, figure out how to arm it later. It was a Potemkin village in orbit. The second futile response was on the ground. The strategic rocket forces, now terrified that their existing missiles were useless, demanded a new generation. They needed missiles that could outfly the American shield. This meant missiles that burned their fuel faster, rising out of the atmosphere before the lasers could lock on. It meant missiles that could deploy dozens of complex maneuvering decoys to soak up the laser's fire. This directive gave birth to the Topol M, SS-27, and the RT-23 Molodets, SS-24. These were brilliant machines, technological marvels in their own right. But they were born from a place of fear, not a place of strategy. They were designed to counter a weapon that didn't even exist yet, a ghost in the sky. The final, desperate confrontation came on May 15, 1987, On a launch pad at Baikonur, the hopes of the Soviet High Command rested on the world's most powerful rocket, the Energia. Strapped to its side, painted in black, was the skiff Polyus. The launch itself was a success. The Energia performed flawlessly, a stunning display of Soviet engineering muscle. It roared into the sky, carrying its 80-ton payload of fear and imitation. Once in orbit, the Polyus separated. The plan was for it to ignite its own engines, maneuver into its final combat orbit, and unfurl its antennae. But the designers, rushed and terrified, had made a simple, fatal error in the guidance software. A single line of code was wrong. Moments after separating from the Energia, the Polyus began its automated sequence. It was supposed to pitch 180 degrees to fire its engines away from the Earth, pushing it into a higher orbit. Instead, a flaw in the control system caused it to pitch 360 degrees. It completed a full, useless pirouette in the dark. When the engines ignited, they were pointing the wrong way. The 100-ton, multi-billion-ruble centerpiece of the Soviet Star Wars response, the asymmetric counter to the American Ghost, fired its rockets directly at the Earth. It decelerated. It became a very large, very expensive, and very black brick. It plunged back into the atmosphere and disintegrated over the Pacific Ocean, in almost the exact same stretch of water where the Primorye had, 4 years earlier, witnessed the birth of the very idea that had destroyed it. The Americans had defeated their enemy's Death Star without firing a shot. The Soviets had defeated themselves. The killer statistic wasn't found in a dogfight. It wasn't a tally of tank kills in a European plane. The verdict was delivered in that silent, sterile moment of subtraction, miles off the California coast. 5 missiles fired, 5 missiles deleted. That 100% kill ratio, achieved by a flying laboratory that should not have existed, was the only statistic that mattered. It was a perfect score in a test the Soviets didn't even know they were taking. The Airborne laser laboratory, the Argo, had proven one thing. The fundamental mathematics of the Cold War had been rewritten. The Soviet equation for survival, our thousands of missiles will always overwhelm their defenses, was now just a theory. The Americans had presented a single, terrifying data point that suggested the answer to that equation might be zero. The true legacy of the Airborne laser laboratory, however, wasn't the laser itself. The all was, in truth, a magnificent dead end. It was a prototype, a proof of concept. The technology was too bulky, too volatile, too chemically inefficient to ever be a practical field-ready weapon. The program was eventually retired, its insights flowing into the next generation of solid-state and chemical lasers. The NKC 135 amperes Argo was eventually put into storage, a relic. But the Soviets didn't know that. And it didn't matter. The macro theme, the true impact of the Primorye incident, was not technological. It was systemic. The Cold War was a contest between two fundamentally different engines of human progress. The Soviet Union's engine was one of imitation and mass. It was a centralized, top-down, brute force system. It was designed to copy, optimize, and then build 10,000 of something. It had put the first satellite in space. It had put the first man in space. It could build tanks, rifles, and rockets with staggering, terrifying efficiency. It was an engine of scale. But when that engine was confronted with something, it could not copy something that was not just a better tank, but a different category of reality it seized. The American engine was one of innovation and risk. It was a decentralized, chaotic, and often wasteful system. It was an engine that allowed, and even encouraged, its brightest minds to chase what if. What if we put a laser on a plane? What if we made a plane that was invisible to radar? What if we built a computer that could fit in your hand? This system produced failures, boondoggles, and dead ends, but it also produced leaps. It was an engine of invention. The Primorye incident was the moment these two engines collided. The Soviets were shown a leap in invention. Their response was to jam their own engine of scale into overdrive. The skiff Polyus battle station was the ultimate symbol of this fatal flaw. It was an attempt to imitate a concept, the space-based laser, that the Americans were only just theorizing about. The Soviets tried to build the final finished product at massive scale without first mastering the invention. They tried to build the Death Star while the Americans were still building the laboratory. The result was a hollow shell, a massive 100-ton symbol of systemic failure, rushed to a launch pad by a terrified bureaucracy and ultimately destroyed by a simple software error. A single, fat-fingered line of code had done what no American weapon needed to. It had exposed the entire Soviet system as a bankrupt fraud. They had the industrial might to build the rocket. They had the power to lift the 100-ton payload, but they had lost the intellectual agility to tell it which way was up. This is the true hidden dynamic of the late Cold War. The Airborne Laser Laboratory, this strange, one-of-a-kind flying machine, was more than a weapon. It was a psychological bomb. It, and the Star Wars program it represented, forced the Soviet Union into a race it could not win against an opponent that was largely imaginary. The Soviets bankrupted themselves, tore their own engineering bureaus apart, and accelerated their collapse, all in a desperate attempt to catch a ghost. The laboratory and the void. In the end, the Cold War was not won by the ICBM. It was not won by the tank division, or the spy, or the battleship. It was won by the laboratory. The lasting image of American dominance is not a mushroom cloud. It is a quiet, sterile, empty space on a radar screen. It is the void where a missile should have been. The Soviet Union had built an arsenal to fight a war of kinetics, a war of steel, explosives, and uranium. They were prepared at any moment to fight World War III. The Americans, in the high desert of New Mexico, in the Silicon Valleys of California, in the laboratories of ARPA, were quietly preparing to fight World War IV. A war of information, of microprocessors, of stealth, and of light itself. The Soviet generals, staring at Captain Volkov's impossible data, were men of the 20th century. They were masters of a material world. But, in 1983, on a day that looked like any other, they looked at a radar screen and saw the 21st century staring back. And in that moment, they saw a void. A void they could not fill, a future they could not build, and an enemy they could not and would not ever understand.